And thank you, Sam, also Samantha Fletcher for supporting us and moving us forward in this work. I want to welcome everyone today. The fact that you showed up today is already a testament to your mental health, right? You took a break out of your day, even if you didn't take a full break and you're kind of multitasking, you're still here with 1 or 2 years um, to listen to ways in which we can increase our mental health. As Olivia said, we've been holding space for the past year in many different capacities. And as we were thinking about this webinar for January, I thought to myself, what a better way. There's no better way to start the new year 2026 with a focus on mental wellness. So welcome to 2026. It has started in very complicated ways for some of us more than others, depending on our identity, depending on where we're from, depending on where we live. And so I just kind of want to name that. It's a hard time. And so now more than ever, it's really important for us to think about our mental wellness, not only for us, but for our clients too, and for the families that we work with. And I think that's kind of what makes our job so difficult is that we are holding our own traumas, we are holding our own experiences while we are also caretaking and helping others move through obstacles and combat systemic oppression in many ways. So I just want to honor all of the work that you're doing and thank you. All of you on this call are doing really important work, and I am, and we are so grateful for that. So, full stop there as we get started. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Laura Quiros. I am many things. I am an associate professor of social work at Montclair State University in New Jersey. It's where I live on the land of the Lenape. I've been here for about 18 years. I have 2 daughters. I identify as a Black Latino who's also Jewish. And so I grew up in homes of racism and anti-Semitism and sort of on the cusp of many identities, which led me to the work of what I call belonging. Inclusion work. I work in the university with Masters of Social Work students, undergraduate students, and I also do a lot of consulting with non-for-profits around trauma-informed social justice. And in addition to that, for those of you that can't see me, just to give you a view of what I look like, I have long brown hair, I'm wearing gold hoops, I have glasses, a black sweater, and I'm brown, but even a little more sun-kissed because we had the opportunity to go to Florida to watch my daughter play soccer. She's a big soccer player, so we just got back from there. So I always think it's important just to not only tell you my identity, but also my physicality, because I can't assume that everybody can actually see me. And so I'd love for us to begin just in terms of how I always like to start whatever really training I'm doing. And sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. But because we're talking about mental wellness, I always ask the question of sort of how accessible are you? Right. So, and you can write it in the chat or you can think to yourself, but your day is already, for some of you on East Coast time, halfway through. And so, on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being the most accessible in terms of presence, in terms of active listening, in terms of well-being, where are you on that scale? And so, I always start my morning with meditation and check-ins. How am I today? How am I showing up today? Where am I on that continuum of 1 to 5? Sometimes I think of numbers, sometimes I don't. But it's just a way for me to check in with myself and check in with folks that hold space with me today. So just thinking about that, I think it's important for us to kind of name where we are. If you're on a 1, that's fine. I wish you lots and lots of well-being. And if you're on a 5, then that's fantastic. So again, and please feel free to kind of use that in your practice too. Just starting the space with how accessible are we, because it gives us an idea of where people are at, right? We can't always assume that people are there ready to be engaged because there's so many things happening in people's lives that we don't know. So I see people responding in the chat, and thank you for leaning in. For those of you that know each other, maybe this is a question you want to ask at a meeting later today. How accessible are you? So thank you all. Olivia is going to help us with the slides today. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through some slides, if there's moments during something that I'm saying, or if there's a slide that you have questions about, I don't want to wait to the end of the slide. You can just press that little hand button, and then we can unmute you and you can step in. Thank you also for those of you who are not only sharing your numbers, but also giving some context to that. People are saying they're dealing with other things in their lives. They're kind of here, they're kind of not. So really thank you for being vulnerable in that space. So we can start off with the first slide, Olivia, moving past those introductions and sort of my own um, website, which we'll put in the chat for you, where you can see some of the work and actually one of the recordings from our last Lunch and Learn. So why does this matter in crisis work? It matters for so many reasons, and these are just some highlights, right, to ground us in mental wellness. You all are exposed to trauma on the daily, right? That secondary trauma. And I often call, some of you who have held space with me before may have heard me say this, but I often call crisis workers and social workers restorers of the soul, because I believe our work is to kind of go back in there with a client and help them uncover the wounds or ways of being that have covered up wounds as trauma. And as we do that work of restoration, and we're going to talk a lot about that work of that word restoration today, we take on some of that energy, right? We are exposed to it. And I think I have learned that in the field, there is a normalization around secondary trauma, right? That this is what we do, so we should be okay with it. But every now and again, it's really important to name that, because that is not normal, right? That when we work with trauma, it is a secondary reaction, and we hold that. We hold that in our minds, we hold that in our bodies. And because of that, moral injury and burnout is really, really common. I'm probably not saying anything you don't know before, but I've learned that in my work, you know, with students or with people in organizations, that you can't really say it enough, right? We have this pressure to stabilize without context. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes we're working with individuals and families, and we're working with that trauma in that moment without a context of what else is going on, right? And so that's really important too. And so in our work today, I think probably the most important thing I want to share from my perspective is that I would like us to start thinking about mental wellness, not from an individual space, but from a collective space. So I want us to move from how are you taking care of yourself to how are we taking care of yourself. And I've really been thinking about this lately, because I think it's been my experience, speaking from the eye, that in the political, socio-political environment we're living in, we're like moving more and more to individualism and not to community and not to collective care. And for me, that's almost like an injury, right? Like I live my space in with the lens of community. I can only see the world through my own lens, right? As an Afro Latina who's also Jewish, who is pronouns are she, her, who is able-bodied. That is my lens. And so I need my community who have different identities to step in and do this work together. It was interesting. Like, I'm going to share some anecdotes as we share space today, but I have two daughters, and one of them is 12, and she struggles a little in school. She's sort of like a perfectionist and wants everything right all the time. And I get really frustrated with her because I just want her to speak her truth. And we had a back and forth yesterday during our homework time. And I called her teacher, and her teacher was so supportive. And we ended up having this conversation about how we can't do it alone, right? Like I can be the best parent in the world, but it's only through my lens, right? And so I want us in our work to really think about collective care. When I am working with a client, you know, when I am teaching my student in my class, that is just one part of their lives, right? After I leave them, they're going to different providers, they're going to different classrooms, they're going to different agencies. And if I'm just focused on my one work and not wondering how they're doing in all those other areas, I'm not modeling community for them, right? And so I think this is very important, and I'm repeating myself, but again, sort of the emphasis on how are we moving from how are you taking care of ourselves to how are we taking care of ourselves. And again, we don't have a lot of role models these days, right? And so those of you in our space today who are leaders, I mean, all of you are leaders, but those of you that have a team, whether you're managers or whether you're supervisors, thinking about how you're modeling this community, this collective care perspective, this way of being where we are moving from the I to the we. So thinking about that for a minute. And again, I just want to reiterate that if anyone at any time has any comments or any questions, please raise your hand and we'll move through that. So let's move on to the next slide. Naming the current reality. So again, and I've said this when I started, but we are in the space of collective and cumulative trauma. And so I know for myself, I'm in academia and the semester is about to start and it's back to business as usual. But when we're just back to business as usual and people aren't kind of naming what's happening, it almost feels like we're minimizing the trauma that's happening in the world. And so, just recently, like the day or two after New Year's, when we even just speaking about current events for a minute, the situation in Venezuela, right? Like I was very conscious about what part of my Latin community is from Venezuela, right? That's where part of my family is from. I have friends that are Venezuelan, right? Just thinking about beyond just my own worldview and understanding how these events that are happening, right? Acts of anti-Semitism, acts of hate crimes, the bias, the ICE, the immigration, right? Business as usual, yes. And also, how are we thinking about, especially for our clients who are not originally from here, right? Who do have family in other countries, who are scared to leave their homes. And that's what makes our job so hard, is that we are dealing with that secondary trauma of the individual trauma, but we're also dealing with the collective trauma. And we are people with identities also. So understanding that crisis is ongoing, right? Some of you here are crisis workers, and that crisis is living in our environment. And so how are we asking workers and clients to carry that, right? Like, how are we helping them, and how are we understanding that even if we may not have that answer, that this is all around us? And so naming that current reality and not just sort of moving back to business as usual, taking a pause, checking in with people, understanding that on some days our accessibility may be a 5 and on other days it's a 1 because of the collective and cumulative trauma that is ongoing in our world today. Any thoughts before we move on? Just checking in with folks. Are we good? Okay, let's move on. So again, we're talking about mental wellness, right? Understanding that this is a collective effort, understanding that this is incredibly important in trauma work, understanding that it is absolutely necessary to name the current reality and that we are holding this. I want us to think about this difference between the words restoration and resilience. So I'm a social worker, I'm a social work educator. Social work is like central to my identity. And I've lived in this space and I've heard that word resilience so many times, as I'm sure you have, and I'm sure you have used it as I have, right? That client is so resilient. They are so resilient. I can't believe how resilient they are. I am so resilient. And while that may be true, right, that people have the capacity to endure, sometimes, and this is just a question, I try to kind of question things. Like one of my practice tools is curiosity instead of declaration. I always like to dialogue and ask questions rather than make declarations, because again, I only know the world through my own space. But one of the things I've been thinking about is that when we talk solely about resilience, we're almost minimizing the systems of oppression that impact the individual. So by saying, for example, that person is so resilient, yes. And also, are we giving permission for them to be resilient despite all of the systems that are oppressing them, right? So resilience implies endurance, whereas restoration, right? Restoration centers dignity and centers repair. It centers the fact that we have to restore the system, right? That we cannot return to normal. That person may be so resilient, but they shouldn't have to endure that oppression. They shouldn't have to endure that trauma. How do we move from, yes, saying somebody may be resilient and also saying that that system or that way of being or that policy needs to be restored to center dignity, right? Because when we just focus on resilience, we're only focusing on the individual in that moment and not talking about the systems and the ways of being that are harmful that need to be restored. Does that make sense for folks? I've talked about this before, and for some it's sort of a new conception. So I just wanted to see how people are sitting with that, and if anyone has any thoughts on that, anything at all. I'd love to hear voice. It's always sitting here like I'm talking to 90 people, but I don't know who's. I love the chat, and I'd love to hear your voice too. If anyone wants to step in and kind of expand or question anything that I'm saying at all. Any thoughts on restoration and resilience? How might you think about using those terms or the restoration terms as a substitute for resilience in your practice? Diane, please. Thank you. I think we need to unmute Diane Albert.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Great. It seems like resilience, while it always feels good to hear that word, it's really actually fluid. That one day you may feel resilient and able to bounce back from negative experiences that you deal with on a daily basis. But restoring seems like a gift, like it's almost like it can be, other people helping to restore your dignity
Yes.
and your ability
Yes.
and to cope and to live. While resilience, it sounds nice, but it doesn't often feel nice. I mean, it's sort of like you're on your own, you've overcome some obstacles, great, we'll applaud you. But
Yes.
what happens the next time you have a failure or something negative experience? Are they there? No.
Yeah, and Diane, that point, like what happens when the system breaks down or when you're too overwhelmed by everything that is going on that you just can't endure, right? Then does all of that go away? Then you're not resilient anymore. I love everything that you have shared.
Thank you. That's all.
Okay. No, thank you. And people are, I think, commenting and supporting you in the chat too. I think we have another hand raised. Chika Doli, am I pronouncing your name right? Olivia, can we unmute?
Yeah, I've sent the request a few times. I'm not sure. Oh, it looks like they're unmuted.
There we go. Yeah, it's just done.
Yes, you said it right, but I'm gonna say it so you can see
Please.
how I say it in my accent. It's Chika Odele.
Chika Odele.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this platform. The topic is really nice. I get so passionate when I saw the email come. I said I must join. Because in the place of work, you talk about resilience. It is like the former speaker said, it sounds so great when you hear that, and you want everybody to have that because it's more like a foundation of dealing with trauma. Unfortunately, not everybody gets to reach that level. And at the place of work, especially where we work here, I'm in a CBO, mental health. People deal with this every day. And we as workers don't pay close attention to realize that people do have trauma and they still have to come to work and deal with trauma people. It's double jeopardy for human in general.
Yes. Yes.
And constantly we among ourselves, because we don't see it, we constantly instilling that trauma in each other.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't make it any better. So for restoration, some people again do not have the ability
Mm-hmm.
to get to that level. And what
Mm-hmm.
do we do at this point? For me, I have a lot of compassion when something is going on, when you people are, so when you're trying to restore or that level of resilience, it's a lot to deal with.
Yeah.
Some
Yeah.
people who can get there, they have impaired judgment and they're
Mhm.
still at work. And sometimes people do stuff and you go like, how can she do that?
Mm-hmm.
And instead of us trying to understand, have compassion and approach in a better way,
Yeah.
we instill more, doesn't make it better. So my point is this: let's have compassion in helping that person to return to repair or to have some dignity or endurance in going back to resilience and restoration. It's a huge word. It's
Yeah,
difficult to get to.
it is.
Yeah.
And thank you for that. I've all, thank you so much for that. There's so many great comments in the chat. And I just got a little, and so I want to say two things. And then if other people want to unmute, Naomi, Karen, Sydney, I saw some of your comments coming through. In my work, just so I can like ground you in like my own, my like way of being, whenever I introduce something in a training or in my classroom, it's not the end all be all, right? It's just an introduction. So by no means am I saying, don't use the word resilience anymore. That's not what I'm saying. I'm offering a curiosity around how we use resilience and what comes next in terms of restoration. Sydney, I got to see a little bit of your comment, and I haven't done the research on restoration, so I don't know, but it would be really interesting to understand how restoration fits in that space, in the research space, along with resilience. So again, this is an offering as I was thinking about this and my own work with my students and with my clients, just and social work in general, like, right, which oftentimes I must say leaves out some complexity and nuance. And so I got really excited by the word restoration when thinking about this work in the context of mental wellness and as crisis workers, social workers, moving clients from a place of just being resilient to, okay, how do we move towards restoration and where does that fit in? So I just wanted to say that. Any more comments? I saw some beautiful things in the chat. Does anyone want to unmute and say anything else? Okay. Okay, great. So let's hold that and move on to the next slide. So again, when we're thinking about mental wellness so far, and I'm just going to review kind of where we're at because I like for things to kind of come together. Understanding that we are in crisis ongoing, right? It's not just one moment. The complexity of our work requires us to kind of understand and name our secondary trauma, understand the burnout that comes with that and the moral injury, understanding that not naming the current reality often minimizes where people are at and doesn't lend grace to how accessible they are in the moment. All of this work around mental wellness is grounded in our identity, right? I often say that identity is epistemology. We understand the world through our identity, so what that means for me is that the access to mental wellness is very different depending on who we are, depending on who our clients are, depending on all of those intersecting identities. And then understanding when we're talking about mental wellness, not only for our clients, but also for ourselves, how are we thinking about these words and practices of resilience and restoration? Do we believe that as mental health workers, as social workers, as crisis workers, that we are responsible just for naming that resilience, and or are we moving to those places of restoration in terms of the systems that cause the oppression, and understanding that with restoration also comes wholeness and comes dignity? And then finally, moving that question from how am I taking care of yourself? How are you taking care of yourself? To how are we taking care of ourselves? And centering that collective care that is not normative, nor is there a model in the world that we see around us today. And so thinking even about your team meetings and your organizational cultures, what is that culture? Is that a collective culture? Is that a culture of restoration? Is that a culture of curiosity? Is that a culture of understanding that when things happen in the world that we are taking a pause and naming them from that trauma-informed approach, right? So here we have this framework that I'm constantly working around, right? No matter what topic, I am looking at it through a trauma-informed social justice lens. And what that means for me is that trauma is socially produced, that yes, we have individual trauma, but 9 out of 10 times that trauma is from those systems of oppression. It's not just from those individual experiences, right? Those systems, that intergenerational trauma that we see, that we take care of, that we hold. We understand that our identity, as I said before, shapes our experience and shapes how we care, right? Like the ways that we've been socialized and how we understand ourselves shapes how we care. And so again, in your organization, in your agencies, it's important to understand what that community care looks like and not be assumed, right? Because the way that I care is very different from the way that you care. The way that I take care of my clients is different because of ways that I've been socialized and through my training. The other core framework that I want us to consider is that relationship is the site of change, right? How are we building relationships? How are we teaching our clients to build relationships? Because relationships are healing. And a lot of the individuals that we work with have been harmed through relationships, right? And so that community of care and understanding how I don't want to say positive and I don't want to say healthy, but how a relationship that cares, what does that look like? Right? What does that feel like in our bodies? And then also that liberation is a wellness outcome, right? Those of you that may have heard me speak before, I do a lot of work on joy and liberation. Joy and liberation enhance mental wellness. And our field tends to be very deficit focused, right? We focus on what the presenting problem is, and we don't bring those aspects of liberation or joy into our work. And when we don't do that, we are further minimizing, right, the ways that clients may heal through joy and through liberation. And how do we hold both? How do we name that joy and move towards that liberation and look at that as mental wellness, even when the world is so dark at times? So I'm going to pause for a minute. Any comments or questions about kind of this core framework of mental wellness through a trauma-informed lens? I'd love to hear some thoughts. Is this how you tend to view mental wellness? Do you think about mental wellness from a trauma-informed lens? When we think about mental illness, are we only thinking about sort of well-being in that individual space? Are we thinking about all of the factors that go into that, including liberation and joy? Any thoughts from our audience? Or any thoughts on how you may incorporate this into your organization during times of despair, which are pretty constant? Oh, Pamela, go ahead.
Pamela, are you connected to an audio? I'm not seeing the button to unmute you unless you are already unmuted. For some reason, the request unmute button is not appearing next to your name.
Okay, I don't know what happened. Oh, Pamela needs help. Jeff, you had put something in the comment. Do you want to name that? Do you want to share?
I'm sorry, I'm going to request Pamela unmute. The button appeared now.
Okay, great. We apologize, everyone. There's a little delay in the audio. Okay, Jeff, I got you.
It says request has been sent, Pamela. I'm not sure if anything is popping up on your WebEx application or browser.
Lawrence, in the meantime, do you want to unmute you? I saw you wrote a lot in there that I couldn't get to, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. Or Sandra. I think some of these thoughts in the chat could be helpful for other people.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Okay. I think that the broader funnel of a person's background and trauma helps us understand the immediate moment far better. And I wanted to introduce something that just happened yesterday for a moment. A client is in the hospital. Basically, the parents orchestrated that, a grown man. He does live with them. But yesterday he teared up and told me about things he suspected in his childhood as to why he doesn't trust and why he's paranoid with these parents. Now, that view, having worked with this client for a long time and being informed about the trauma, perceived or real, helped me to help that client.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's so valuable
Mm-hmm.
because the client truly understands that my intent is to help him.
Mm-hmm.
And it alleviates his paranoia and allows me to enter in more completely.
Yes. Yes. Which I am guessing is relief, right? Like
Is what?
relief, literal
Oh,
and figuratively. Yes.
tears I've never seen.
Yes. Relief.
Gentle tears, no drama,
Yeah.
real inward pain.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Lawrence, do you want to step in, or Karen, you also are sharing in the chat? No? Okay. I know people have so many thoughts, which would help others as well, but I also understand if folks don't want to step in and share. The other thing that I just want to say in relation to this is that we've all had our own experiences as it relates to mental wellness. And so how are we opening up our own lenses to question our own ways of being, right? Like, I think sometimes in our field, I have also learned that I tend to be very wedded to how I not only view the world, but what my practice is. And I have tried in the past, few months to be more open, right? To let other ideas or thoughts or ways of being in. And sometimes that feels really scary, but also sometimes that feels really exciting because I see my sort of lens expand and I'm not so stuck on sort of the ways that I have been trained or the ways that I have worked with clients, even if it has quote unquote worked in the past. So hopefully we're learning from each other and we're being curious about ways in which we might want to add things to our practice, add things to our mental illness as well. So thank you all for sharing in the chat. And if you do want to speak up, please do. So Olivia, we can move to the next slide. So, I want to talk about truth. And I say that in quotes because I think oftentimes we are searching for a truth that isn't there, or maybe it's our truth. Pamela, I loved what you said before when you were talking about your client. You said real or perceived. And I heard that, and I want to uplift that because I think oftentimes we are stuck in sort of this right or wrong dogmatic way of being. regime that doesn't allow for the flexibility and honestly doesn't allow for the restoration and stops us from looking at the structural harm. The structural harm becomes invisible. And so I want us to think about this word truth and how it shows up in our work and how it shows up in terms of mental wellness. And I'm going to add Pamela's word of perceive because I know from my own experience, right, and I am speaking from the eye, that there are often times when I see things or when I experience things, particularly as a woman of color in predominantly white spaces, and somebody will tell me that that didn't happen, or they don't see that power dynamic, or that wasn't really real, that's just my own interpretation, and that causes harm, right? That causes harm for me. And so thinking about just this word truth, right? And is there a truth? And are we thinking about when clients talk to us about their experiences, right? Are we unintentionally, because I do believe we all have good intention. I don't know any of you, but I entered this space with the perceived notion of good intention for everyone here. At the same time, I often think that good intention is a veil to some harm sometimes, right? That because we are crisis workers, social workers, people in the helping field, it is assumed that we have good intention, but sometimes that good intention does not match with the impact of what might happen, what somebody might say or what might happen. And so I just really want us to think about how we can be, or perhaps be more flexible, right? In understanding that our truth isn't the truth, right? And if something is happening, how are we seeing it through a different lens, but also understanding, not minimizing things that may be happening in the environment, right? And so I spend a lot of time journaling and writing, even when I'm in spaces where my truth isn't honored or the situation is minimized, right? I find some of that comfort in my own allies and in my own writing. And I see we have Lisa. Can you share what you wrote? Because I can't see all the chat and it sounds like it's pretty beautiful from the little bit that I'm reading here. Would you mind having us unmute you? Or Olivia, if you could see all the chat, maybe you could read that. I feel like we're missing out on some of these comments.
Sure, and Lisa, please feel free to raise your hand if you would like to speak more on that out loud. But Lisa wrote in the chat, I am a peer specialist in training. I am an interfaith minister and a multi-creative woman, she, her pronouns. I am a poet, writer, memorist, editor, graphic designer, photographer, singer, and songwriter. I use the arts for healing. I create writing workshops and seek funding to help publish and produce work.
Thank you for that. So I just want to bring in the creative writing piece on that, because I also feel like we don't do a lot of that. And so how are we helping ourselves and our clients beyond just the cognitive space, right? Crisis work, social work, psychology, helping profession work tends to live a lot in the head and not so much in the writing space, not so much in the body, not so much in the art space. And so in those moments, I find it very helpful to kind of bring that in, especially, and what's resonating here for me as I bring this in right now is those moments when I've had to take care of my own mental health, when I haven't felt the collective, right? And so in those moments of denied truth, what am I doing in order to make myself whole again? So thank you for that.
And Lisa was just unmuted. I just sent the request again.
Hi.
There we go.
Hi.
How you doing? Well, what specifically would you like to know?
Oh, nothing. What your chat said was perfect.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, I appreciate
It's nice to be recognized. I mean, I'm trying to put myself out there more because this is a new experience for me, I'm interning.
that.
I did the Howie the Harp. I'm in, New York, and yeah. So I'm interning at a supported education place called Blueprint, which is actually part of, it's under the umbrella of community access. So I'm actually in the same space, like a different room, but in the same office spaces where I took my training, which I really love. And it's nice to be here. And it's nice to be recognized as a person that experiences sometimes mental health concerns, but is also, I find this community to be so compassionate to each other and really giving permission to, you know, to have feelings and to talk about them and write about them. And so I've been writing a lot. I've been writing and being an artist a long time, and my latest thing, and I've been doing music a long time, and songs come to me, and I'm always encouraging other people to write and to
Mhm.
express themselves creatively.
Yeah.
It's very therapeutic. So one of the things I'm trying to do is to find where I can use my peer special, my, you know, my peer training to help people in those creative modalities, using writing, using poetry, and using music. And I'm going to be putting a show together for the end of the month. But
Thank you.
thank you for sharing and for
Yeah.
having this venue.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for leaning in. And I just, it's just reminding me that, our field sometimes is like void of emotion when it comes to the kind of expert behind, our expertise. And I always find that interesting, especially in the classroom, encouraging my students to be vulnerable and to name and notice what's happening, not only in the classroom, but in themselves. And so I really think I hope always for communities, collective communities of care where we can lean into each other and just do what we just did, right? Like recognize each other and name and notice and talk about what's happening in the world, and understanding that our way is only one way, and that even if you are not seeing that truth from that client, that is their truth, right? And holding that and then being able to take care of ourselves at the same time. So thank you for all of that. Let's move on, Olivia. Thank you. So again, I think I said before that I had done a lot of work on joy and liberation in the trauma space, because the trauma space, I think, is void of liberation and joy, which is ironic because trauma is healed through liberation and joy. And so one of the things I really struggle with in terms of mental wellness is when systems of harm aren't named, right? When we don't talk about what's happening, when we don't validate responses, right? When we live in that space of neutrality, and not kind of speak truth to practice. And I think oftentimes what happens is that oftentimes we move to abstract conversations instead of explicit conversations. And so really thinking about for your own practice, what is the connection between truth in practice and mental wellness, right? That when something is validated, as Pamela said, there is a relief, right? Especially for clients who are so live in a world where they haven't been recognized, where they haven't been named, where their harms have not been noticed. Again, in my own therapy, my therapist is always saying, Laura, where does that live in your body? Where does that live in your body? And I'm able to do a body scan and say that lives in my shoulders, that lives in my stomach, that sometimes lives in my heart, right? And so in order to move to that space of mental wellness, which I hope I am always kind of moving in that space, right? By those morning check-ins and checking in with myself and with my students and with my colleagues, that I am having this whole body experience. And again, that being very difficult in a world where systems of harm aren't named, where we're ignoring what's happening in the present reality, when we're just focused on ourselves and their one individual session and not concerned about what happens when the client leaves the space and moves to another space. And so really thinking about, even though it's very hard, how do we name truth in practice? I think oftentimes people stop naming truth in practice because they think it's going to do more harm instead of seeing it as a release. Um, so just really thinking about that. Any thoughts about that? Truth in practice. Okay, let's move on. Why truth protects workers, right? It reduces shame and isolation. It counters burnout narratives. It reclaims ethical clarity, right? And so thinking for ourselves, right? I'm moving back and forth between our clients and between ourselves, between our clients' well-being and between our own well-being. And again, understanding that our identities really matter in this space. So truth not only really protects and validates the experience of our clients, but as I said before, it also validates and protects ourselves. Next slide. So let's go back to this word of restoration. And as I had shared before, the older that I sort of get, and as this world moves as it's moving, I am really trying more to live in the space of my body and in the space of practices such as creative writing and yoga, because that's where I feel the steadiness. That's where I feel the balance. That's where I feel the pause. That's also where I feel the restoration. I don't know about you, but when I feel that my body is whole, when I feel hydrated, when I don't feel exhausted, when I feel that I'm able to hold space for individuals, when my nervous system is steady, that to me is the time I feel the most enhanced mental wellness. And I think in our field, it's really hard to find that balance. It's really hard to find that calm. It's really hard to quiet our nervous systems. And so one of the things I've also been thinking about, one of the things I've also been doing is about is understanding how this shows up not only in my students, not only in the leaders that I work in, but in also the organization. And so how are we restoring our bodies as well? And again, in traditional social work, I know there are probably a few of you here today, and I know there are a few of us in our field that do that body keeps the score work, that does that body restoration, but it's not normative, right? Like I held space the other day in an organization, and before I even started the workshop, I did a grounding, right? I did a 3-minute grounding. And people were uncomfortable, right? I did a deep breath, I did a body scan, and it was basic stuff, but I think how do we kind of move this into our practice more, not only for ourselves, but for our clients too? Our nervous systems are constantly dysregulated from that secondary trauma, right? We know this. We know how the neurology of trauma affects our brain, affects our body when we are under pressure, when we are stressed. We show up differently, right? That might look like, for example, our emails are shorter, or we have a tone, or we're not able to hold eye contact, or we are more withdrawn, we get introverted. And so when we're thinking about our organizations and the ways in which we respond when we're under pressure, are we sharing those spaces and telling each other, when I am under pressure, this is what happens. When I am not feeling well, I act like this. I don't think we do a lot of that. And so how do we find that space to create the community of care through vulnerability, through intention, through explicit dialogue and relationship building? So I know what my colleague feels like and acts like when they're under pressure. I know what happens when somebody experiences a session or working with a family, and there's so much secondary trauma that their nervous systems become dysregulated and they are activated, and they start acting different, right? And so I don't think we know this about each other. I think we are more shy about the ways that we are dysregulated as workers, but that impacts our clients. And so how do we create an organization where we are restoring the body, where that becomes normative, where team meetings start with the grounding, right? Where we talk about the ways that we've been dysregulated and how we've regulated ourselves as a model of vulnerability, especially for those of us in leadership positions, right? Dysregulation is a protection, right? And our bodies hold memories. We know this. We know the work, we know the research, but we forget it, right? And we often stay in this cognitive space instead of moving to how we restore the body as an organization, as a team, as an individual, with our clients. And so I've been taking this work very seriously because, I've noticed for myself, the more body work I do, the more I'm able to just settle. And you know, a lot of us enter this field because we have our own trauma, right? Me included, a lot of it. And that lives in here, right? And so I am trying to be, I mean, I'm human, so I'm fallible, but I really have tried to move into this space and make these practices more normative, because I actually think it helps in the context of where we are today. So I'm going to pause for a minute. I don't know if anybody has any comments or thoughts or ways that they have, you know, regulated their nervous systems, or organizations that are just so good at this, or other things as it relates to this that people want to share. I know we only have a few minutes left, so I want to keep going through the slides, but I'd love to hear some voices too, if anybody wants to. Okay, well, I hope that resonated with folks, and that you have stories to share outside of here too. So let's move on. So again, sort of embodiment in crisis setting with clients, understanding the importance of short grounding moments. Attunement is so important. Like, you know, I teach a generalist practice class to my social workers, but as social workers, as crisis workers, like, how are we attuning into the client? And the only way we can sincerely attune in is if we are able to attune ourselves, right? And so again, that's breath work, that's body work, that's bringing in different cultural practices, understanding that sort of one way of being isn't the only way. And so really moving this work into our organization, with ourselves and with our clients. Next slide. So the other piece of this, and we're moving towards the end here, is the word of belonging. And I think we all can think about a time when we didn't feel like we belonged, whether as a child, as an adolescent, as a young adult, as an adult, right? We've all definitely had moments where we have felt like we do not belong. And that hurts our hearts, that hurts our bodies, that doesn't allow us to feel our full selves. And so this work can be really isolating. And also, I am thinking and questioning organizations and how they foster feelings of belongingness, because there's a direct correlation between feeling mentally well and feeling like you belong, right? And I think, again, naming the current moment, a lot of us, depending on our identities, are being told that we don't belong, right? And so how does that message impact ourselves? How does that message impact our work? How does that message impact our clients that are being told they don't belong? That's real, right? And so belonging, we know, is a protective factor. And so I would love for all of us to have some intentionality around it's, I don't even call belonging a word, I call it a practice, right? Around the practice of belonging, and how we are intentionally working towards creating systems of care, collective systems of care, of belonging. And we can do that in many different ways. We can do that through vulnerability. We can do that through curiosity. We could do that by looking around and seeing who else is not in the room. We can do that by validating the hurt that is happening in the current reality to many of our clients and ourselves who are marginalized by society, right? And thinking about, in terms of our organization, how our teams foster a sense of belonging, and within that belonging, how we are also bringing in the work of joy and liberation, because when you feel liberated and you feel joyful, it is a direct correlation to belonging, right? And so if you're just living in that deficit mindset, you are not creating those communities and cultures of care where there is a feeling of belonging. Next. So again, you know, just going over the importance of the relationship, importance over the building trust, you know, going over how healing is co-constituted between me and you, and between and us, right? That intersubjectivity, thinking about those moments when you are seen. When do you feel seen? Who in your life do you feel seen by, right? That equals care, and that equals mental wellness. Next slide. And then we'll have about 2 minutes for some questions. So again, belonging at work requires this concept of psychological safety, which looks different depending on who we are, depending on what organization we are in. It looks like identity without assimilation, right? I don't need to assimilate into a professional culture to belong. I need to be me, right? And then creating those space for joy, for liberation, and for meaning. Next. Moving from collective care, we talked about that in the beginning, right? So individual coping is insufficient, I think, especially in a helping profession. And so moving from how are you taking care of ourselves and how are we taking care of ourselves? And I would say that organizations hold that responsibility to do that work collectively. Next. And so then just sort of our closing reflection, we talked about so many things today, right? And so my question to all of you is, what resonated for you? What was the one thing that I said or that I questioned or that somebody said in the chat that created a sense of curiosity for you, right? The work around restoration as collective work, the body, right? And all that it holds, the belonging as protection, naming the truth, naming the current reality, all leads to mental wellness, right? And we are in a moment, right, where there is a lot of mental unwellness. And so what is our responsibility to take care of each other in this moment? And so I will pause there. And if anyone has any questions or comments before we end today, I want to thank you for your comments. And I know this was a lot and we could probably be here for another hour. But anything else that anyone wants to share, please feel free to put it in the chat or in the last 2 minutes. Please unmute. I'd love to hear voice. But mostly I wish you safety and I wish you health. And I just wish you a lot of gratitude for taking time out of your day to be here with us. And I wish you all love too, in the capital L.
Thank you all so much. I don't see any hands up. Just to inform you all, I will be sending out the recording of today's training, the slideshow, as well as a feedback survey, hopefully by the end of the week, in a few days. If you wouldn't mind submitting some feedback, that would be wonderful. It's all anonymous and it helps us shape our future training offerings. And on that note, we will be hosting a training in February, and you should expect to see that notice through the Public Information Office or however you received this training notice, hopefully also within a few days. Thank you all so much for joining. And as always, please feel free to email me if you have any comments, questions, or concerns.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Take care.